The gravimeter's needle swung wildly as Dr. Sarah Chen stepped onto Research Station Xi's docking platform. 3 different alarm systems activated in rapid succession, their alien tones creating a cacophony that echoed through the crystalline structure. She couldn't help but smile. Her mere presence was literally setting off alarm bells. "Please remain stationary, Terran Representative Chen." The station's AI chimed in what she assumed was meant to be a soothing tone. "Your mass is causing unexpected gravitational readings, recalibrating sensors for Deathworld parameters." Sarah stood perfectly still, her magnetic boots locked to the platform, watching as a group of Halaxian scientists hurried toward her. Their crystalline bodies refracted the station's ambient light, creating dancing patterns on the walls. The lead researcher, who had introduced himself as First Resonator Ixel in their earlier communications, approached with careful, measured steps. "Dr. Chen," Ixel's voice rang like wind chimes in a storm, "your reputation precedes you. But I must admit, the actual gravitational distortions your presence causes are remarkable." His crystalline form vibrated with what she recognized as scientific excitement. "We knew humans were dense-bodied beings, but seeing the readings firsthand." "Just wait until I start moving equipment around," Sarah interrupted with a gentle laugh. "And please, call me Sarah. We're going to be working closely together on this gravitational anomaly of yours." The other Halaxians hung back, their transparent forms clouding slightly, their species equivalent of nervous fidgeting. Sarah was used to this reaction. As Earth's leading expert in extreme gravitational environments, she'd learned that most galactic species found humans simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. It wasn't just that Earth was classified as a death world due to its gravity, atmospheric pressure, and volatile climate. It was that humans had evolved to thrive in conditions that would crush most sentient species. Yes, about the equipment, Ixel's crystalline surface rippled with concern. "We've prepared a specialized laboratory for your use, with reinforced workstations and redundant safety measures." Sarah checked her datapad, reviewing the station schematics she'd studied during her journey. "I saw the specs you sent over. With all due respect, you're going to need to reinforce them further. Those tolerances are rated for standard galactic heavy world species. I'm human. We're in a category of our own." As if to prove her point, she took a single step forward. The gravimetric sensors screamed in protest again, and one of the younger Halaxians actually backed away, their crystalline form briefly shifting to an alarmed frequency of violet. "Fascinating." Ixel vibrated at a frequency Sarah recognized as deep thought. "Your species evolved under constant gravitational pressure nearly twice what most consider survivable. Yet you move with such casual confidence." Sarah began walking toward the main research complex, her steps measured and careful. She'd learned the hard way that her natural gait could stress standard station architecture. "That's actually why I'm here, isn't it? Your gravitational anomaly is registering forces beyond what your equipment can reliably measure. Forces that, for a human, might actually be manageable." The corridors of Research Station Xi were a marvel of sinoengineering. Crystalline structures seamlessly merge with advanced technology, creating spaces that seemed to float in the void of space. But Sarah's trained eye noticed the reinforced sections, the doubled and tripled support structures. They'd prepared for her arrival, or at least, they thought they had. "The anomaly," Ixel began, his tone shifting to a more serious resonance. "It's unlike anything we've encountered. Our most advanced sensors simply fail when we attempt to study its core. The gravitational forces exceed our ability to measure them. Which is why you called Earth's foremost expert in extreme gravitational environments," Sarah finished, reaching the laboratory that had been prepared for her. "Because sometimes you need someone who evolved to handle the impossible." The door slid open, revealing a lab that looked more like a fortress. Every surface was reinforced, every instrument doubled or tripled in durability. Sarah ran her hand along a workbench, feeling the solid construction. Still not quite strong enough, but it would do for now. "There's something you're not telling me about this anomaly," she said, turning to face Ixal. His crystalline form vibrated at a frequency she'd never seen before. Was that fear? The readings you sent, the patterns of gravitational fluctuation, they're not natural, are they? Ixal's response was cut off by a deep rumble that seemed to come from the very core of the station. The lights flickered, and Sarah felt a familiar pull, the distinct sensation of gravity going wrong. No, Ixal admitted, his voice barely audible over the growing disturbance. They're not natural at all, and they're getting stronger. Sarah smiled grimly, already running calculations in her head. Well then, you definitely called the right human for the job. Show me what we're really dealing with. As they moved deeper into the station, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a simple scientific mystery. The way the other scientists watched her, the extensive preparations for her arrival, the carefully worded reports, everything pointed to something bigger, something that had the entire galactic scientific community worried enough to turn to a Deathworlder for help. She was about to discover exactly why. The gravitational wave hit without warning. Sarah's coffee mug shattered against the ceiling, along with half of her laboratory equipment. But while the Halaxian scientists around her struggled to remain upright, their crystalline forms vibrating in distress, she simply adjusted her stance and continued studying the readouts. Impact force approximately 12 Earth gravities, she announced calmly, reaching up to catch a floating data crystal before it could smash into a delicate sensor array. Duration 3.2 seconds. The wavelength pattern suggests artificial origin. She turned to Ixal, who had anchored himself to the wall. Want to tell me what's really going on here? Impossible. One of the junior researchers chimed in, their forms still rippling from the gravitational disturbance. No biological entity should be able to function at 12 gravities, let alone maintain cognitive awareness and... I trained in Jupiter's gravity wells, Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of experience. This is barely a workout. Now, about those artificial gravity waves. Ixal's crystalline surface clouded, a sign Sarah had learned meant deep concern. We should move this discussion to Secure Lab 7. The information is sensitive. The walk to Secure Lab 7 was telling. Every corridor they passed showed signs of recent reinforcement. Support structures had been doubled, tripled in some places. They weren't just preparing for a human visitor. They were preparing for something much worse. The anomaly, Ixal began once they were sealed inside the secure lab, originated 3 standard months ago during an attempt to create stable artificial gravity wells. The project was meant to revolutionize space travel, allow for more efficient. Skip the cover story, Sarah said, examining the lab's heavily reinforced equipment. These aren't transport research tools. I'm looking at military-grade gravitational focusing arrays. The silence that followed was heavy enough to rival Earth's gravity. Finally, Ixal's form shifted to a frequency Sarah hadn't seen before, resignation mixed with fear. We were developing defensive capabilities, he admitted. After encountering your species, after learning about Deathworlds and the beings they produce, the Galactic Council felt we needed countermeasures. Sarah laughed, the sound echoing off the reinforced walls. So you tried to weaponize gravity against Deathworlders, and it backfired spectacularly. That's why you needed me. I'm the only one who can get close enough to study it. The containment field is failing, another scientist added, their crystalline form pulsing with anxiety. Each collapse generates waves of increasing intensity. Our models suggest that within 14 standard days, the field will fail completely, releasing a gravitational singularity that could tear this station and this sector of space apart. Sarah finished, already running calculations in her head. Show me the core. The containment chamber was a marvel of engineering, layers upon layers of gravitational nullifiers and force fields surrounding a sphere of pure darkness. Sarah's instruments whined in protest as she approached, their sensors overwhelmed by the forces at work. Current core gravity is approximately 40 Earth standard, One of the scientists reported from the safety of the observation room. No known species can. Sarah stepped through the first containment field. Dr. Chen. Ixel's voice rang with alarm. The human safety protocols won't work, she called back, her voice strained but steady as she pushed through the increasing gravitational pressure. Your safety systems are calibrated for galactic standard beings. I need direct readings. Her reinforced datapad cracked under the pressure, but not before registering crucial data. Sarah smiled grimly as she stepped back through the containment field, her muscles burning pleasantly from the exertion. Well, I have good news and bad news, she announced to the stunned scientists. Good news is, I can get close enough to study and potentially stabilize the core. Bad news. She held up her shattered datapad. We're going to need stronger equipment. A lot stronger. You just walked into 40 Earth gravities, one of the junior researchers whispered, their form flickering between shades of disbelief. How are you still standing? Because humans don't just survive on a death world, Sarah replied, already sketching plans for reinforced monitoring equipment. We master it. Now let's talk about what you're not telling me about this weapon you were trying to build. The gravitational core pulsed behind them, as if responding to her words. Sarah felt the familiar pull and smiled. They had brought her here to help contain what they saw as a disaster. But she was beginning to suspect this accident might be the greatest breakthrough in gravitational science since Einstein. If they survived long enough to study it. Another wave hit, stronger than the last. Equipment cracked, sensors failed, and warning alarms filled the air. But Sarah stood firm, her mind already racing with possibilities. They had tried to create a weapon to defend against Deathworlders, only to create something that only a Deathworlder could help them control. The irony wasn't lost on her, but as the containment fields flickered ominously, she knew they were running out of time to appreciate it. Sarah's modified sensors screamed as another gravitational pulse ripped through the station. 3 standard days of work, and the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted. She watched as her reinforced equipment displayed readings that would have been considered theoretical just weeks ago. Core instability increasing exponentially, she announced to the observation team. We're seeing gravity waves that could tear apart a small moon. She turned to Ixel, who had insisted on staying despite the danger. Time to tell me what's in that core. And this time, I want the actual truth. The crystalline scientist's surface rippled with complex patterns, fear, guilt, and something else. The weapon wasn't meant for mere defense, he finally admitted. The Council, they wanted to create controlled Deathworld conditions, to study them, to understand how beings like you are possible. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. You tried to recreate Earth's gravity well, our entire planetary evolution in a controlled environment. Not just Earth's conditions, came a new voice. A tall, silvery figure emerged from the shadows of the observation room. Ambassador Nexus of the Galactic Council, their fluid metallic form reflecting the emergency lights. We attempted to recreate the conditions of all known death worlds. Simultaneously, the pieces clicked into place. Sarah looked at her readings with new understanding. You idiots, she breathed. You didn't just create a gravitational weapon. You tried to compress millions of years of evolutionary pressure into a single point in space. Another wave hit, stronger than ever. Support beams groaned. In the distance, something massive cracked. Sarah's modified sensors displayed impossible numbers before shorting out completely. The Council feared the rise of Deathworld species. Ambassador Nexus continued, their metallic form rippling with what might have been pride or fear. We needed to understand how to create our own, to level the playing field. By playing God with fundamental forces, Sarah's laugh was bitter. The gravitational core isn't unstable because you lost control. It's unstable because it's trying to do what you asked, create evolutionary pressure, but you can't contain that kind of force. It's not just gravity in there anymore, is it? Ixel's crystalline form clouded completely. No, the latest readings suggest space-time manipulation. Reality distortion. The core is trying to compress billions of years of evolution into a single point. And now it's breaking free. Sarah concluded. She pulled up the last readings from her destroyed sensors. These patterns, it's not just growing stronger, it's growing smarter. The station shuddered again, but this time the gravitational wave felt different. Directed. Purposeful. Emergency systems blared as entire sections of the station began to compress under impossible forces. "It's aware," Ambassador Nexus whispered, their metallic form actually showing cracks under the strain. "We created something that can control gravity itself, and now it's conscious." Sarah watched as the containment field around the core flickered, patterns emerging in the waves of gravitational force. Not random destruction. Communication. The thing they had created was trying to talk. "You wanted to understand Deathworlders." She stepped toward the containment chamber, feeling the pull of forces that should have crushed her. "You should have just asked. We could have told you that evolution isn't about force or pressure or gravity. It's about adaptation. Change. Learning to work with the forces trying to destroy you." She reached the first containment barrier, her muscles straining against forces that would have liquefied most beings in the galaxy. The core pulsed, its gravity waves forming patterns that her scientific mind was beginning to recognize. "Dr. Chen," Ixel's voice rang with alarm. "The core's gravity is approaching 70 Earth standards. Even you can't." "Watch me," Sarah gritted out. She took another step forward, her reinforced boots cracking the floor beneath her. "You wanted to understand how Deathworlders survive. This is how. We don't just endure, we reach out. We communicate. We learn." The core's patterns changed, its gravitational pulses synchronizing with her movements. It was learning, adapting, just as life on Earth had adapted to crushing pressures and impossible conditions. "Ambassador," Sarah called out, her voice strained but clear. "Get me a direct link to the Galactic Council. They need to understand what they've actually created here. This isn't a weapon anymore. It's a bridge." The gravity waves pulsed again, but this time they felt almost curious. The thing in the core was reaching out, not to destroy, but to understand. Just as humanity had always reached out to the stars, despite evolving on a world that should have crushed them. Sarah smiled through the pain of extreme gravity. They had tried to weaponize evolution itself, only to create something that proved what Deathworlders had known all along. True strength wasn't about domination or control. It was about adaptation, communication, and the wisdom to know when to reach out instead of strike back. Now she just had to survive long enough to make them understand that. The station's superstructure screamed as reality itself bent around the core. Sarah stood in the eye of a gravitational storm, her body fighting forces that should have torn her apart. But she remained focused on the patterns emerging in the waves of distorted spacetime before her. "It's a language," she called out to the observation room, her voice tight with effort. "The gravity waves, they're not random. The entity is using gravitational fluctuations like we use sound waves." Through the reinforced observation window, she could see Ambassador Nexus and Ixel struggling to maintain their forms against the increasing gravitational stress. Most of the other scientists had evacuated to the outer rings of the station. "Impossible," the ambassador's metallic voice wavered. "No conscious entity could evolve in such conditions. You literally tried to compress evolutionary forces into a single point," Sarah interrupted, her eyes never leaving the swirling patterns of gravity before her. "Did you really think nothing would emerge from that?" Another pulse hit, but this time Sarah was ready. She shifted her stance, moving with the gravitational wave instead of against it. The pattern repeated. 3 pulses, a pause, then 2 more. Mathematical. Deliberate. "It's counting," she realized. Prime numbers. The universal language of intelligence. She pulled out her last working device, a heavily modified gravitational pulse emitter she'd rebuilt from station equipment. "Let's answer back. Dr. Chen, the containment field is at critical failure." Ixel's crystalline form vibrated with panic. "If it collapses." "It won't," Sarah declared, activating her device. It groaned under the strain as she used it to generate a careful sequence of gravitational pulses. Because we're going to give it what it really wants. And what is that? Ambassador Nexus demanded. The same thing every conscious being wants, Sarah replied, feeling the entity's attention shift to her pulses. Connection. Understanding. You tried to weaponize evolution, but you created something that evolved beyond weapons. It's trying to understand us, just as we're trying to understand it. The core's response was immediate. Gravitational waves danced around her in complex patterns, mimicking and building upon her simple numerical sequence. The containment field flickered as the entity pushed against it, not to break free, she now realized, but to reach out. The station's structural integrity is failing, Ixel reported, his tone filled with resignation. We need to evacuate. No, Sarah cut him off. We need to let it out. Absolutely not. Ambassador Nexus's form rippled with alarm. The gravitational distortions would tear the station apart. Only if we keep fighting it, Sarah countered. She input another sequence into her device, this time incorporating patterns she'd observed in the entity's own communications. You tried to contain the force of evolution itself. How did you think that would end? The entity responded to her new sequence with what could only be described as enthusiasm. The gravitational waves became more focused, more controlled. The random destruction decreased as the being learned to fine-tune its effects. Look at your readings, Sarah commanded. The gravitational forces aren't decreasing, but they're becoming ordered. It's learning control. She took another step toward the containment field, her muscles screaming under the strain of nearly 100 Earth gravities. But she kept moving, kept transmitting her mathematical patterns into the swirling darkness. Dr. Chen. Ixel's voice held a note of wonder. The wave patterns. They're stabilizing. Because it finally has someone who can talk back, Sarah explained through gritted teeth. Someone who evolved to withstand the forces it generates naturally. You wanted to understand Deathworlders. This is it. We don't just survive impossible conditions. We learn to work with them. The entity's next pulse was different. A complex mathematical sequence that made Sarah's remaining sensors overload and die. But she understood it perfectly. It wasn't just communicating now. It was offering a proposal. Ambassador, she called out, her voice strained but clear. I need emergency authorization to disconnect the containment field's power core. That would destroy the containment completely. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. Because containment isn't the answer. Never was. You can't contain evolution. You can only work with it. The entity knows how to control its gravity now. It's offering to help us understand it. A moment of tense silence followed, broken only by the groaning of overstressed metal and crystal. Finally, the ambassador's metallic voice rang out. Authorization granted. May whatever gods exist have mercy on us all. Sarah's fingers flew over the emergency controls, initiating the containment field's shutdown sequence. As the barriers between human and gravitational entity began to fall, she felt something she never expected. A sense of recognition from the swirling vortex of gravity before her. They had created this being while trying to understand Deathworlders. Now, in perfect irony, only a Deathworlder could help it take its first steps into the galaxy it had been born to explore. The final containment field fell, and reality itself held its breath. 3 months after the gravity crisis, as the Galactic media had dubbed it, Sarah Chen stood before the Galactic Council's Science Division. Through the chamber's vast windows, a sight unprecedented in galactic history drew every eye. A controlled singularity, dancing in complex patterns that even the most advanced AI struggled to decode. The entity, now officially designated as Gravitational Intelligence Alpha, but nicknamed Newton by the human contingent, had proven to be far more than anyone expected. The entity doesn't just control gravity, Sarah explained to the assembled representatives, her voice carrying across the stunned chamber. It understands it in ways our physics can't yet comprehend. What we perceived as destructive forces were actually its attempts to model and manipulate spacetime itself. Holographic displays showed the transformation of Research Station XI, where there had once been emergency reinforcements and containment fields. Now stood the galaxy's most advanced gravitational research facility. The station's very architecture had been redesigned with Newton's help, using gravitational fields as support structures. But the most significant discovery, Sarah continued, nodding to Ixel, who now stood proudly at her side, isn't about gravity at all. It's about evolution, adaptation, and the true meaning of strength. Ambassador Nexus, their metallic forms still bearing stress marks from that fateful day, leaned forward. Elaborate, Dr. Chen. You tried to weaponize the forces that created Deathworlders, Sarah said, watching as Newton performed another complex gravitational dance outside. Instead, you proved why Deathworlders were never really the threat you feared. True strength, true evolution, isn't about domination. It's about adaptation, communication, and growth. The chamber filled with murmurs as Newton created a perfect zero-gravity sphere around itself, a demonstration of control that defied conventional physics. The entity didn't need to be contained or controlled. Sarah continued. It needed to be understood. Just as humans and other Deathworlders don't need to be feared, we need to be understood. We evolved under extreme conditions not to conquer them, but to work with them. She gestured to the new data scrolling across the chamber's displays. Newton has helped us develop technologies we never thought possible. Gravity-assisted propulsion systems that could revolutionize space travel, medical applications using controlled gravitational fields, even new insights into the fundamental forces of the universe. All because a Deathworlder decided to communicate with it rather than contain it, Ixel added, his crystalline form resonating with pride. Which brings me to our proposal, Sarah said, straightening to her full height. The establishment of the Galactic Evolutionary Sciences Division. Not to study how to weaponize evolutionary forces, but to understand how different species adapt and grow. To learn from each other's strengths rather than fear them. The chamber erupted in discussion, but Sarah wasn't finished. Newton has agreed to be our first teacher. And yes, I said agreed. It's not our experiment anymore. It's our partner. Just as humans and other Deathworlders shouldn't be seen as threats to be contained, but allies to be understood. Outside, Newton performed another complex gravitational pattern, one that Sarah now recognized as its expression of joy. The being had evolved beyond its creator's intentions, just as humanity had evolved beyond the crushing gravity of Earth to reach for the stars. The galaxy feared Deathworlders because we represented something you couldn't control, Sarah concluded. But we never needed to be controlled. We needed to be understood. And now, thanks to an accident born of fear, we have a chance to build something new. Something better. She looked out at Newton, remembering the moment when fear had given way to understanding. You wanted to understand how Deathworlders not only survive but thrive in impossible conditions. This is how. We don't fight the universe. We learn to dance with it. The council chamber fell silent as Newton created a perfect model of the galaxy in gravitational waves, each star and planet represented by precisely controlled points of force. A display of both power and artistry that proved Sarah's point better than any words could. So, she asked the assembled representatives, shall we learn to dance together? The vote that followed was unanimous. As Sarah watched Newton continue its gravitational ballet against the backdrop of stars, she smiled. They had sought to understand Deathworlders by recreating the forces that shaped them, only to create something that showed them a better way. Not through force or fear or control, but through adaptation, communication, and understanding. The true strength of a Deathworlder had never been in their ability to survive crushing gravity or deadly environments. It had been in their ability to reach out, to adapt, to turn hostile forces into tools for growth. Newton pulsed a greeting to her in their private gravitational language, and Sarah pulsed back. Together, they had proven that the greatest force in the universe wasn't gravity or evolution or even fear. It was understanding. And that was a force that no containment field could ever hold.